Obviously, the people that settled the New World came from the southern part of Spain, the seafaring peoples. And so, therefore, the influence that was prominent in Andalusia continued, and its influence carried over into Latin America, both in terms of pronunciation but also in terms of preference of art style. I thought what I'd do is just very briefly remind you that the Americas were supposedly discovered just before the turn of the century in 1492, and less than 50 years later, Spain had conquered the Western Hemisphere and set up its colonization program. It took very short time, 40 to 50 years. And so I thought it might be kind of interesting to hear some music that might have been heard at the Court of the Kings. And so I'll start off with a selection by Juan Vasquez, written right, we're not sure when, but 1520, 1530, in that range. You'll hear some voices, some polyphonic voices, singing accompanied by a very interesting instrument, which we'll talk about in just a minute. The piece that we're going to be listening to is Gentil Señora Mía. It goes on for a length of time. It's very beautiful music. It's very haunting. The modalities, the cadences that are distinctive to the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period stand out, and it almost makes you think that you're not sitting here in the Clark Building, but you're surrounded by masonry and tapestries hanging and censers that are burning and a feast that's being delivered, and the next thing you know, you've got this kind of music that you're listening to. I wanted you to hear the flavor of that music because that style of music was prominent from the 14th century onward, increasingly sophisticated and closely related to the other music of Europe, particularly of Italy, that shared some cultural ties to Spain, but distinctive in its own right because of the influence of the Moors. And one of the things that made it distinctive was the influence of the vihuela. The vihuela was actually, in the 13th century, an instrument that started out in the Persian Empire as the simple viol. It was an instrument that was bowed and played all the way through Europe for many years, but it had its origins in the Persian culture. And it made its way into the Iberian Peninsula with the Moors and the Arabs that came. Interestingly, that wasn't the only instrument that passed through Spain, but it's the one that stayed. I couldn't find a really, really good picture at the last minute to show you, but I've got a recording that I'll just hold up the picture. It may be a little difficult to see at the distance, but it's available for anybody that wants to come to see it. And it looks a little bit like a guitar. It's flat-backed. It has that distinctive shape that we associate with a guitar, but it's also a shape that was associated with a stringed viol. Somewhere in the 14th century, people quit bowing this thing and they started plucking it. And it gradually started to evolve into what eventually became the Spanish guitar. During the period of time that we're talking about, the guitar and the vihuela coexisted, the vihuela being the instrument of choice for the educated and the aristocratic classes, and the guitar for the uneducated, more popular classes. The vihuela was to be plucked and the guitar was strummed. And by a century and a half later, the two instruments had merged, the vihuela had disappeared, and the guitar had taken over. But you hear that this music sounds like it's accompanied by a lute, or in this instance, it was a vihuela. Interestingly, the vihuela, or the lute, caught on everywhere else in Europe, and it didn't really have very much of a life in Spain, but it passed through Spain to get to the rest of Europe. Its name, the lute, actually comes from a Spanish word, laúd, which then was translated into lute in other places. I want to play for you now, if I can, one of the pieces of music that was for lute solo, because that will introduce the golden age of Spanish music. With your permission, I'll just talk while this is going on. So sounds like a mandolin in a way, doesn't it? This is a piece called Fantasia in Quinto Tono by Alonso Mudara, which was one of the really important vihuela composers. Early in the 16th century, several things combined to make lute music and lute-accompanied music come to the foreground, one of which was the printing press that allowed for the music to be printed and commonly dispersed. Second of all, that the Spanish composers developed a way of notating their music, so it wasn't just passed down from oral tradition, but it was actually written down, and one person who had never heard the piece before could recreate it based upon that tablature. It's an interesting sound, don't you think? During the 16th century, there were 7 really prominent vihuelists who wrote music in a variety of styles, some of it just instrumental, as you just heard, but much of it vocal. And the vocal music was interesting because it had the same flavor that the polyphonic music that you just heard had, but instead of the multiple voices, the vihuela picked up in its own sort of plucked way the multiple facets of several lines of music, and one of the lines was relegated to the vocalist to sing, and it was notated that way because it was done in red ink, and the rest of the lines were done in black ink. And so it all of a sudden became possible for a soloist, a troubadour, if you will, to perform and accompany himself instead of having to drag a consort everywhere he went. The consort music still continued. At court, there were consorts that were made up of viols and plucked instruments and drums and tambourines and multiple voices. And that music continued to be performed, but at the same time there was this flowering of these 7 composers. Let me just tell you some of them. Luis Milan was the first one, and he wrote his first book called El Maestro in 1536. It was followed by Tres Libros de Música en Cifra para Vihuela by Alonso Mudara in 1546. Luis de Narváez was Seis Libros de Delfín. These books sort of revolutionized the way that plucked instrument was done. Then I mentioned to you Alonso Mudara, and then after that came Enrique de Valderrábano, Silvas de Serenas, Siren Songs, Diego Pisador, Libro de Música de Vihuela, which came out in 1552, Miguel de Fueñana, Orfénica Lírica, in 1554, and finally Esteban Daza, El Parnaso in 1576. So all of a sudden, in slightly more than 50 years, there was this enormous flowering of music that influenced not only the music in Spain, but also the music in Latin America. I'd like to share with you now a piece of music that I heard for the very first time when Gabriela Quesada came and performed for us back in, when was it, October or November, so it was last semester. And one of the pieces of music that she was able to dig out of the libraries in Lima was a piece that was written back in, I think it was 1536. I guess I didn't write down the time. But it's a piece called Anakpacha. It's a ceremonial Inca song, but it's not written like Inca music. It's written like European music. I'd like to have you listen to a little bit of that. That sounds just like straight out of the 16th century, don't you think? The program says this is an Incan ceremonial song to their god, whom they acknowledge as the creator of heaven and earth and who lives in Anakpacha, the highest place in heaven. But it doesn't sound that doesn't sound like Peruvian music, does it? It sounds like European music. Even though the language is Indian dialect, it isn't distinguishable from the European counterparts, which gives it an evidence of the fact that that history and musical styles in Europe very much influenced the musical styles in the Americas. As a matter of fact, when the conquistadores first came along, they brought musicians with them, and those musicians had several roles to play. One was to entertain the troops, generals in particular, and the other one was to establish schools of music where the natives, the American natives, could be taught Christianity through the use of music. And then these converts would then be available to serve in the religious services in the cathedrals and in the churches of the day. So within a very short time, Mexico's first musical school was established in 1523. Think about that. The conquest isn't even complete yet, and there's already a school started to train the Indians in the traditions of Western music, Western European music. And they got really good at it. But along the way, they also did their own stuff. And the unfortunate thing is that we don't have any record of it, except that it existed. It wasn't written down. Obviously, no recordings made, and we can only surmise what the music might have been like. It'd be fun to know. Anyway, I wanted you to hear that the influence crossed the ocean pretty readily and very quickly. Just a couple of other details. The Vihuela songs, of which there are several hundred, have a lot of different topics and appear in a variety of different languages. They appear in Spanish, of course, Portuguese, which would be logical, but they also appear in Italian and some French as well. And the topics go anywhere from historical things. There's a piece called Paseavase el Rey Moro, really beautiful song that talked about the Moorish king walking on the parapet of his castle and grieving over the loss of the Alhambra. There's another one that's biblical, historical, talking about King David and how he grieved for Absalom, his son, when he was dead. There are other ones that celebrate regions in Spain from which the composers came. I'll sing some of those in just a minute. There are romantic songs, high romantic songs. There are naughty songs. There are picaresque songs. And so it covers a wide gamut of stuff. Let's see, what else would I like to say? The songs sometimes were through composed. Sometimes they were organized well. They'd have an estribillo, and then they'd have kind of a coplas. The coplas were the verses, the estribillo was the refrain. And many of them were through composed. I think what I'd like to do for you now is sing a couple of examples. The first one is called O Más Dura que Mármol, and it's by Miguel Fueñana. And this song is a lament over a hard-hearted woman. Life hasn't really changed in the last 400 years. Men still lament hard-hearted women. It never goes the other way, of course. I'll just make a note that in the original form, this was called a soneto a quattro. In other words, it was for 4 voices that had been adapted for solo voice. And the original composer was a man named Pedro Guerrero. And so that is also another indication of the patterns of that time. The troubadours would pick up the music that was popular of the day, and they would adapt it to their own use and publish it. And they did have the scruples enough to indicate that it was originally composed by somebody else. O más dura que mármol a mis quejas. O más dura que mármol a mis quejas, y al encendido fuego en que me quemó, más helada que nieve, Galatea, estoy muriendo y aún la vida temo, temola con razón, temola con razón, temola con razón, pues tú me dejas, que no hay sin ti el vivir para que sea vergüenza que me vea ninguno en tal estado de ti desamparado y de mí mismo yo me corro ahora. De un alma te desdeña ser señora, donde siempre moraste no pudiendo de ella salir un obra. Salid sin duelo, salid sin duelo, lágrimas corriendo, salid sin duelo, salid sin duelo, lágrimas corriendo. So you get a sense that they had some romance. Just let me read a text from another one that I was thinking about doing by Diego Pizarro. And this will give you a feeling for that these people also had a sense of humor. Si te vas a bañar, Juanica, dime a cuáles baños vas. Then refrain, Juanica, cuerpo garrido. And the simple meaning is that this person wants to know where Juanita's going to bathe because she's sure beautiful when she's bathing. Now I'd like to sing something called the Vienesca. I'm not going to take too much time to talk about the styles, but just let me say in passing that one of the styles of the day was the Villancico, which was a polyphonic song, and it, again, was adapted for this solo usage. A Vienesca is similar to that, and it's entitled Vienesca Cuatro de Caballos, or Ceballos. We're not sure who the right pronunciation was. The interesting thing about this piece is it's the only one out of this whole repertory of several hundred songs that was actually notated for a voice like mine. The rest of them were notated for higher voices, none of which are overtly high, but many of them are sort of that for a high middle voice, a low soprano, or a low tenor. But this one's actually written for in the bass clef. It was originally notated that way when printed. This is called Dime Manso Viento, and it tells a beautiful place that the poet wishes to return to, and he also wants to know if in that place they've seen the girl that he loves and if she remembers him. He's singing to the wind and asking them to search her out and invite her to come back to the place where he first loved her.
Las fuentes de mirada, su rostro y su cabello, que nunca ha visto el sol, que nunca ha visto el sol, que nunca ha visto el sol, los rostros más bellos, que nunca ha visto el sol, los rostros más bellos, otros más bellos.
This style of music has sort of long since gone out of vogue, and it's something that holds a historical interest to me, and it certainly harks back to a period of time. But that time's gone now, and only those who enjoy either historically or musicologically go back in and enjoy the haunting nature of this kind of music. For some reason, as the century turned into the 17th century, the vihuela just dropped out of vogue. And there was an enormous resurgence of polyphonic music, both secular and sacred. And so there's not much that I could perform for you today, and so it doesn't hold my interest if I can't sing it. But about that same period of time was the emergence of a new form that dominated the 17th century, and that was the zarzuela. The zarzuela was just simply an entertainment that was started and performed at the Palacio de la Zarza. And it was like the French counterpart. It had entertainment in it. It had dancing. Some of it was popular. Some of it was ballet. They had spectacle, grand costumes, processions, and it was all designed for courtly entertainment. And that material, the first one of the zarzuelas that appeared was La Selva sin Amor in 1629. So you can see that was really early. And I want to kind of put that in context. The inventors of opera lived in Italy, and the very first opera ever recorded was in 1600. That sort of marks a watershed moment in the music history as we depart from the Renaissance, where the music is polyphonic, and move into the Baroque, where the music is now beginning to be organized chordally, vertically structured, and not as independent voices that interweave with themselves. But interestingly enough, that change in musical tastes and styles, which began in Italy in 1600, had already had its forerunners in Spain 75 years earlier. And I'm sure that this opera, though I don't know the history, I'm sure that this opera by Lope de Vega was patterned after the music that was sweeping all the way through the Italian courts. It started in 1600, but within 30 years it had become a popular entertainment form, lost its purity of declamation, and become a display piece for singers and for audiences that were interested to having their ears tickled. That disease never seemed to attack the musicians in Spain. The love for florid music just didn't somehow make it to Spain, and so they avoided some of the excesses that the Italian singers went to. Notwithstanding the fact that one of the really prominent composers or performers at the court a century later was the very famous castrato Farinelli, who brought with him all of the Italian predilections, but it hadn't arrived yet. Another one of the important pieces from that day was Los cielos hacen estrellas by Juan Hidalgo. This had choruses in the madrigal style, the polyphonic style of the day, and lots of solo pieces. But it employed something that was really distinctive. It actually used Italian recitative, where the notes were sung, the dialogue was sort of sung to set pitches in a formulaic pattern. That wasn't the pattern that the zarzuela continued to have, because it, right from its beginnings, with a few exceptions, had musical numbers interspersing the spoken dialogue. So it was a play with that spoken dialogue into which music was interpolated, much in the form of the Italian comic opera. The serious operas, they were through composed and had recitatives, but the zarzuela did not, by and large. Well, the works during the 17th century in this form just became more elaborate and more grand and more serious, and they revolved around stories from antiquity or mythology, and they became the plaything of the elite. About the end of that century, or about two-thirds of the way, three-quarters of the way through that century, however, there was something that occurred that was very akin to what happened with the Italian opera. You had the opera seria, which were just like that, and then there were little works that were first performed as intermezzos between the acts of plays or between the acts of these zarzuelas, and they were called tonadillas, and they started out simply as a little entertainment, a little song, and then it was a little song that had multiple parts, and then it was a little song that had two people in it, and then they started to dialogue, and there were several songs, and it gradually kind of grew up into its own little form of popular comic entertainment. And it was that entertainment that swept, the zarzuela started to fall into disuse, and the rise of the tonadilla sort of completed that 17th on into the 18th century. Now, why do I tell you that history? Because that history is paralleled in the Americas, although I can't show you examples of that. The troops that were performing in the Old World would sometimes travel to the New World. Performers from those troops would come and they'd form their own troops and they'd perform here. And so much of the music that was going on, the musical styles that were going on in Europe, were mirrored by the music in the Americas. And I'd like to sing several examples. Let me just make sure that I haven't left anything out. No, I think we'll conclude with two examples from Spain. One is the Seguidilla y Bolero. The author is not known. It was just found in an archive and published separately. And then I'll follow that with a song that was very popular, continues to be historically popular from Spain, called La Flor de la Canela. And those two will represent the kind of music that was going on during the period of time when the tonadilla was the most popular. Then I'd like to turn to the Americas and take two American folk songs from the Mexican Californian area, one called Nadie Me Quiere, and the other one is a really well-known folk song from the period, Carmela. And then we'll kind of conclude. Oh, there is one little note that I wanted to say. The very first opera that was written in the Americas was premiered in Lima in 1701. So that's 70, 80 years after the first inception. It's not far behind. You'd almost imagine that they had cell phones that they could move that quickly.
En el mundo no hay ojos hay como los tuyos. Como los tuyos, no hay ojos en el mundo como los tuyos. Nacen en el campo flores, nace la perla en el mar, y tú naciste bien mío para hacerme a mí penar. Y tú naciste bien mío para hacerme a mí penar. No hay ojos en el mundo hay como los tuyos. Como los tuyos, y más cuando me miran con disimulo. Tan imposible lo hallo que tú puedas olvidarme, como escribir en el agua y echar una piedra sangre, como escribir en el agua y echar una piedra sangre. No hay ojos en el mundo hay como los tuyos. Y se los pones un poquito dormido, Jesús entonces, por en medio de esos mundos me voy a buscar la vida. Acuérdate si no vuelvo de quien tanto te quería. Acuérdate si no vuelvo de quien tanto te quería. No hay ojos en el mundo hay como los tuyos.
Now that sounds a little more distinctively Spanish, doesn't it? Has that feeling, but actually it shares a lot in common with the music of the day that was popular in Italy. They're sort of intermersed, but there's some distinctive feelings, the flourishes that linger after with the influence of the Moorish tradition. Okay, La Flor de la Canela. Now keep these songs in mind, keep the sounds of the songs in mind, because we'll finish these and then we'll go to the Americas and see.
El sol del mediodía, donde nacen las morenas y donde la sal se cría. Morena, morena, morena de mi corazón, dame un abrazo y hasta la oración no te niegues, niña, por amor de Dios. se muere sin amar a una morena, se va de este mundo al otro sin saber lo que es canela. Morena, morena, morena de mi corazón, dame un abrazo y hasta la oración. No te niegues, niña, por amor de Dios.
Both of those share in common a very interesting characteristic. You hear them change rhythms. You get to the chorus, and it sort of speeds up and becomes a little more dance-like. So now, let's turn to the Americas. Music that was going on right about the same period of time. And we'll conclude. Incidentally, the music that I'm performing for you has been accumulated over a long period of time, a little bit here, a little bit there, in no systematic search, because I haven't gone to the places where they do it, but I've laid my hands on some stuff along the years, and I'm really glad that I have. There's much to be done. I wouldn't consider myself an expert on this. I'm more an aficionado. My father says that an expert has a particular meaning, and I might qualify there. And all of you probably heard this, but that an X is a has-been, and a spurt is a drip under pressure, and that, right now, that's kind of how I feel. But nevertheless, I'm glad to be here with you. Okay, Nadie me quiere.
Nadie me quiere, no sé por qué, de solterito me quedaré. Nadie me quiere, no sé por qué, de solterito me quedaré. Pero antes que me suceda, viejita mía, dame tu amor. Pero antes que caiga en tus brazos, hecho pedazos mi corazón. Quiéreme, sí, y jamás te olvidaré. Viejita del alma mía, lo que me pasa te contaré. Quiéreme, sí, y jamás te olvidaré. Viejita del alma mía, lo que me pasa te contaré.
Now, you couldn't tell that came from the Americas, could you? I couldn't. And the last one is Carmela. This is also a very, very well-known song. I learned this song when I was a third grader in California and didn't know the origins. And when I came back across it 25 or 30 years later, I thought, that sounds familiar, and that's because it was.
Así cual mueren en occidente los tibios rayos del astro rey, así murieron mis ilusiones, así extinguiéndose va mi fe. Carmen, Carmela, los de mis ojos, si luz no viera, habías de ser hermoso faro de venturanza, dulce
last music that sounds like it comes from Spain. Because interestingly, this music was written just before the time when the independent colonies started to seek their independency. And with the independency of each of the countries was born a desire to not be the same as what the Spaniards had been, to search in their own indigenous music and start coming up with their own nationalistic styles. And that really, truly, is the birth of the art song in Latin America, as composers turn toward their own indigenous music, and the styles of music become enormously diverse. It wouldn't have mattered if I had selected songs from Peru, songs from Chile, songs from Argentina. It wouldn't matter. Up until that period of time, they would have sounded like they emanated from Europe. And so the history of music in Latin America is not separable from the music history in Spain. Incidentally, this spring I'll be offering Music 206 for the first time. This is the history of music in Latin America. It isn't classical music, however, it's indigenous music. We're going to be looking at the various regions, Mexico, Central America, the Andean chain of countries, the Caribbean, and the La Plata region. We're going to look at the indigenous musical styles. And so any of you that are students that would be interested in doing that, joining that class, be looking for it online. Music 206 to be offered for the first time this spring. Thanks for being here. I hope that you've wandered away from BYU for just a little while, found yourself in Spain so that when you go out, you'll be startled.